Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Sin and Tonic. Today's story is that of the Villisca Axe Murders. Another oldie for you guys today. Let's go. Sin and Tonic! Hello, how are we? I hope you're all well. I have survived my tooth extraction and I think I can talk normally, but if I sound funny, that's why, because I have a gaping hole in my face. I'll tell you all about it at the end because it was truly something else. And I have new lights, so it's like Blackpool illuminations in here. It's bright. I am sure that most people have heard about this case. I had heard about this case, but I've never researched this case. So while I thought, I don't know, surely everyone knows everything about this, I just knew of it, I'd heard of it, and I knew basically what had happened, but that was about it. So when I started my research, I was like, oh, it's actually very interesting. So I hope that today, if you have heard this story before, I hope that my research might bring something that you hadn't heard of before, maybe, or, just we can share our views on it. So we are going to the 9th of June, 1912. Back in the day, we're going to Iowa. This was home to the Moore family. We have Josiah Moore, otherwise known as Joe, and his wife Sarah, and they had 4 children. At the time of this case, they were Herman, who was 11, Catherine, who was 10, Boyd, who was 7, and Paul, who was 5. That evening, the family attended their local Presbyterian church. Say that quick. Hope I'm saying that right. Presbyterian church for a special service. This event was actually a celebration of Children's Day, and Sarah had been involved in planning this event and putting it all together. So it was her baby. It sounds really lovely. The children were all involved and they read speeches and it sounds like a really wonderful celebration of children. It sounds like it was a lot of fun. And all of this ended at 9:30 p.m. in the evening. That's what PM means, Sophie. Catherine had asked if her 2 friends, the Stillinger girls, were allowed to come for a sleepover that night, and that was all arranged and that was okay. So the family go home with Lena and Ina. Sorry. You know how much I hate not being able to say the words correctly. Lena, Lena, and Ina. They were 12 and 8. They lived just outside of the town, so they were going to come back to the moors and have a sleepover. This is what happened. They got home. It was quite late. 9:30 is quite late, especially with your kids as well. They get back. They have some cookies and some milk, and then they all go to bed. The only thing that seems unusual, which is just probably because how we are in modern time, is that the 2 Stillinger girls, they slept in the downstairs guest room. So their home was like a 2-storey, and the guest bedroom was on the ground floor. And then, so at bedtime, the Stillinger girls went to sleep on the ground floor of the property in the guest bedroom. And then upstairs, the family went to bed. So the Joe and his wife Sarah, and in a room down the hallway, their 4 children. The following morning, they have a neighbour called Mary Peckham. You know what neighbours are like, right? So she is very used to this family living there. They've got 4 kids. It's normally noisy and loud and busy, and they have animals that they need to get up and tend to, and she notices that the house is just quiet. She knows that Sarah and Joe have gone back with their family that night, so she knows that they were there. They're not on holiday. They're not vacationing. All a bit odd. So she goes round to the house at about 7:30 because she's like, look, they would be up about dealing with their animals by now and they're just not. So she went round to have a little nosy, have a little look. Thank God for nosy neighbours, actually. And she can't get in. She's tried to get in. She's knocked on the door, no answer. She's starting to panic, starting to get worried. No one is answering and she can't get in. The doors are all locked. She then calls Josiah's brother, Ross, and he arrives at the house at about 8 a.m. And he tries as well. He knocks on the door, he tries to get in, and it's all locked up tight. Ross used his spare key to enter the house. Poor Ross. Upon entering, he went in and looked around. He came out and he requested that somebody call Hank, the local police officer. Ross came out of the house, and what he described was just almost unbelievable. He said there was somebody murdered in every bed. And he was not wrong. Every member of the Moore family and both Stillinger girls had been bludgeoned to death in their beds. Each victim had been bludgeoned to death with the blunt end of an axe, apart from Josiah, Joe himself. He was the only victim where the sharp edge of the axe had been used in his murder, and he had also sustained the most blows. This would suggest, I believe, a lot of rage towards Josiah personally, and also, or he was the biggest threat. So you need to take your biggest threat out first, and that would be the strong man in the house, the strongest male in the house. The scene was horrific. It was very gruesome. It was very bloody, especially, again, Josiah, because the sharp edge of the axe had been used on his face. So his face was probably, I imagine, pretty unrecognisable. Someone described it as mangled. And this is where it gets spicy, because this is like just something out of a horror film, really. You can understand where people got their ideas from. Oh, my ears just like went off balance. Each victim, so after they have been bludgeoned, or in Joe's case, hacked to death, their faces were covered with a bedsheet or bedding. So each body, what a thing to find, because it would have been very bloody, but just each body in their own beds, but their faces covered with bedding or clothing. That's just terrifying. It's just terrifying. All of the doors were locked. All of them. And all of the curtains were drawn. And there were 2 windows that did not have curtains. And the killer had placed sheets or clothing over those windows. And this really makes it feel so eerie. All of the mirrors in the house were covered with clothing as well. Right? The killer had gone through the dressers, the drawers in their house to find items to cover the mirrors and the windows. There was a plate of uneaten food found in the kitchen, which they highly suspected the killer had done this. It was uneaten, untouched, and next to it was a bowl of bloodied water, like as if he'd sort of washed himself up a bit before he was going to eat, but then he didn't eat, probably put off his food. The attack was so horrific that in the ceiling of their bedrooms, there were axe marks where he'd obviously lifted the axe and thrown it down on people. Just horrific. So just such a violent and brutal attack on all of the family members. It was discovered that the axe that was used, it was one axe and it belonged to Josiah, which is just feels tragic, doesn't it? It had been kept outside and there was a specific place that it was normally left. And I've got a picture to show where it would normally have been. So the killer had taken that and brought it in for this murder. And then he'd left it in the Stillinger's bedroom, the guest bedroom downstairs, next to a 4-pound hunk of bacon, which they believe the killer had removed from the fridge and then placed next to the axe. Right. The axe was then partially wiped and cleaned before the killer left. Word spread quickly, as it does in villages and towns, and the people of Villisca were on it. Boom. There is a madman in our midst. We need to find him, because they thought, well, this person can't have got far. So they went into, like, what do you call that? Like, action mode. Let's go. They were looking, they were searching, they were hunting. They were also very terrified, because this sort of thing had never happened before. It was a quiet, peaceful, safe place to live. So I can only imagine the fear and the terror. And what's quite sad in this case is that eventually, because it remained unsolved, people turned on each other in the early days. This nice community of people began to point the finger. Well, he was funny. Or, if you didn't like someone very much, like, oh, I think it was him. And it kind of turned the place upside down, and it was a bit bitter. Also, a lot of fear, as you can imagine. So as they went into that night after the murders, Nobody had been found. There was no suspect, nothing. It was just, so there's this person on the loose that has just murdered a family and 2 children, which I can't imagine the pain of the parents of the girls that have had the sleepover there. This is just such a heinous, brutal crime, and everyone's in shock. So that night, families were nailing their windows shut, they were barricading doors, and I think the thing that terrified people the most, and this terrified me a lot, I want to go up in my loft now, is on investigation, which we'll get to in a moment, when they searched the property, the house, what they found in the attic was, they found fresh cigarette butts. This would suggest that the culprit, the murderer, had been laying in wait in their attic. Like I said, this is like the original freaking horror story, isn't it? Waited for them to go to bed, crept up, broke in, hid in the loft, waited for everybody to be asleep, and then murdered everybody in their beds. Grim. One of the parts of this case that makes you like, wow, makes you realise how long ago it was, is the morbid curiosity, I think I'm going to go with, and the lack of care for a crime scene. Buckle up. There was no such thing as CSI. Well, their version, I suppose. However, not long after the discovery had been made, all of the investigators or police had been around and they'd all traipsed around the crime scene. They've had a look at everything. They've searched the property, gone upstairs, found the cigarettes in the attic, all of this. And then they let over 100. I just can't believe it. It's just so bonkers that even that many people they really did have a morbid curiosity. But they let over 100 people in to the house with all of the bodies in where they were to have a look. People went round and had a look, had a walk round, touched things. People touched the axe. So, we're thinking there's not going to be any good physical evidence, and there was not. They already knew that the axe had been wiped, but still. Yeah, so they let people touch things and have a nosy, like an open house. Oh, just have a wander around this crime scene. Would you want to? I am very careful when I look through photos, when I'm looking for photos for my cases. Every now and then there'll be something that's like, oh, this is sensitive, do you want to see it? And I have seen some images by accident that I really wish I hadn't. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the thought, like, I'm still a human being. I know that this was a very, very long time ago, but still, 100 people in that town were like, I'll have a look. I'll go and have a look at that. Apparently, it was almost like they couldn't believe it. They didn't believe it was real. They couldn't believe that this would happen. It was described as people just had to see it with their own eyes. They brought bloodhounds in. That wasn't until about 9 p.m. And those bloodhounds, they smelt the axe, but a freaking 100 people or more have touched the axe. So they sniffed the axe. Oh, you can't really go by that, can you, if all those people have touched it? But the dogs followed, they smelt it, and then they went off and they got to a river, and then they sort of lost the scent, which makes sense. And also that, that could have been the murderer then, like run, and then he might have run through a river. But again, that's sketchy, isn't it? That's a sketchy piece of evidence. And they lost the scent anyway, quite horribly, because I believe people came and went throughout the day to see the scene. The bodies, and let's not forget that 6 of those bodies were children under the age of 12. That's just so sad. But their bodies were there until midnight in that house. The coroner didn't want to take the bodies away until somebody had signed off, and he was like 200 miles away or something like that. So the whole thing was a long process, and eventually the bodies were then taken to the local firehouse, which was like a temporary morgue. People were buying firearms and locks for their doors and windows. All of the locks sold out. because it was a frenzy. And also, so people were looking up their properties, but they were also taking it on turns. People were taking it on turns to watch with a gun. And you can't blame them. That is horrific. Like, if that happened down the road from me or in my village, and they hadn't caught the person, what? I would be off skis. I'd be staying somewhere else. The funerals took place on the 12th of June. So it's quite quick, actually, isn't it, after the murders? It happened on the 9th of June. And all of them had their funerals on that day. Thousands of people attended. I think the community was still reeling from what had happened. They just couldn't believe. And then the investigation had to pick up a little bit, like, who could have done this? It would seem that Joe and Sarah were very liked in the community, but they had to dig deeper. Was there anybody that disliked Joe or his family? One person sprang to mind. Frank F. Jones, a local businessman, and Josiah had worked for him. And then it was all a bit messy, and Josiah left the company, he left Frank's business, and he set up on his own as a competitive company, and he took part of Frank's business with him. That's going to pee him off, isn't it? Not only that, I feel like I'm spilling the tea. Not only that, but there was speculation that Josiah was having an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law, to his son's girlfriend or wife. It seems like she was quite promiscuous, and there were a number of men that she was having affairs with, and Josiah's name cropped up a few times, so it could very well be true. Could not, we don't know, we weren't there. But, so there's these two quite big things that have happened, and by 1910, Frank and Josiah were not speaking to each other. It was a huge feud, and they really fell out. So Frank really didn't like Josiah. Now, everybody knew that Frank wouldn't get his hands dirty himself. He was a renowned businessman. I think he was in Congress or something like that. He was in some form of politics, but he had money, and he definitely had the means to get somebody killed. People were a bit unsure whether he would have gone as far to have his whole family murdered, and also the Stillinger girls, but stranger things have happened, you know. Anyhow, there was a particular man that ended up being linked to Frank, William Mansfield. So whenever Frank's name was brought up and, but he wouldn't have done it himself, he would have hired somebody, who do you think it was? It was this William. He did have a past. At one point, I believe he was charged. However, they found pay slips to prove that he was actually not in the town on the 9th of June. So it was not him, despite his past and despite his link with Frank. Frank was a senator, that was it. There was another man called Andy Sawyer, and he seemed good for it, and he was looked into, he bought newspapers of it, he was obsessed with the case, he really obsessed with it, that's all he could talk about. People were like, this is a bit much actually, this guy, he's really obsessed. He even told people, he was one of those people that goes around really talking about it, and I was there that night, and I think he said, I hope they don't suspect me. They might suspect me because I was there. But it was then proven that he bloody wasn't there, because he was arrested that night at 11 p.m. and it was determined that the family were killed between 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. in the morning. So he couldn't have done it. He'd been arrested. He had an airtight alibi, tight as you can get. Just wanted a bit of attention. So annoying though, isn't it, when they do that? Sarah's brother-in-law was in question, so her sister's partner. He had been in trouble with the law before. He was known to be violent, but again, he was cleared. However, from my research, there were two people or suggestions that stood out to me. One of which was a serial killer. You're like, yeah, right, Sophie. Sounds like it, doesn't it? Brutal attack. It does sound serial killer-ish. But there had been a string of very similar murders in the Midwest leading up to this murder. These all dated back to 1911. Two families in Colorado were bludgeoned to death in their sleep. Then in Illinois, a family were murdered in their beds with a pipe. In both cases, sheets were used to cover their faces and the curtains were shut. A month later, on October the 15th, another family were murdered, and again, very similar. They were covered, and again, the axe that was used had been partially wiped and left in one of the bedrooms. So when I read this, I was like, it does sound very much like Whoever was committing these murders and moving around committing these murders, like a Criminal Minds case, has now just moved into this town, which was also it had a big train line went through it, so anybody could have arrived into Villisca on the train, hopped off, murdered a family. That is not meant to sound as insincere as it did, but you know what I mean. Arrived in the town, murdered a family and moved on. And it sounds like whoever was committing these murders, they did sound very connected. All of the bodies were covered. The axe was left lent in the bedroom, curtains shut and windows and things covered in the house. You know, it sounds like the work of a serial killer very much to me, especially that all of these murders were happening in the Midwest and they were following, you know, they were bunched together in time. Also, and this is quite a specific, what do they call that? Not MO. I can't think of the word. But the killer had placed lamps at the end of Sarah and Josiah's bed, and I believe the Stillingers' beds, and those lamps had the chimneys removed and placed under the bed. That was also the case in these murders that were happening in the Midwest. If that isn't like a signature, that's it, a signature. How on earth, in my mind, when I read that, I thought, well, that is definitely the same person, which to me would then suggest that it wasn't somebody known to the family. It wasn't somebody that lived in the town. It was somebody that had come through on a train, had already committed brutal murders, and then had just done the same here. Awful, really. But it does sound like that, doesn't it? When you think that those cases happened and that all of those things happened in the other cases as well as this murder. Now, this also connects to one of the suspects that I strongly, when I read, I was like, okay, he's the only person that doesn't seem to have an alibi and he sounds crackers. Reverend Kelly. He left Villisca on the 5:19 a.m. train just after the murders. Why is he awake at that time? What's going on? And he was like a travelling reverend. He was born in England. He sounds like an absolute, there were some issues. And then when I think of the chunk of bacon that was left in the bedroom, and all of these little signatures, like placing the lamps at the end of the bed and taking the chimneys off, and doing that at each crime scene, covering the bodies, covering the mirrors. Well, that sounds like the work of somebody that's not all there, someone that's quite suspicious, somebody that also might be religious. He was a travelling reverend, because back in the day, it was a mark of respect for the dead to close the curtains. Also, covering a body, especially the face, after a murder is remorseful, weirdly. It's an act of remorse, and if you are a conflicted person, such as a reverend that has murdered horrifically, that can't help himself, that has a compulsion, a reverend with mental health, who believes in God, but probably the other thing with the mirrors is that it was strongly believed that the spirits of a person could become trapped into mirrors, or if a spirit saw themselves in a mirror, they would become angered and not be able to move on to heaven. That sounds like something that a religious person would like, you know, they wouldn't want that to happen, would they? It's all very like, it kind of, I was like, kind of sat with me, this reverend. And the fact that he left on a train at 5:19, he was out of there. He was described as having a nervous disposition. He'd have had a nervous breakdown when he was a teenager. When he left on that train, it would be another 3 hours until the bodies of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls were discovered. It's about 8 o'clock. It was 7:30, 8 o'clock. And yet, when he was on the train, people said that he was talking about 8 dead souls in Villisca and that they were murdered in their sleep. How would he know that? And that just, you know, when you read something and you think, well, not only that, but it became a massive obsession. These murders became an obsession of his. Again, like the Andy Sawyer. He would write letters to the police, to law enforcement, rambling letters about the case. Also, he wrote letters to the deceased's family. He kept on writing these letters, and they must have been rambly and unusual and made him look like a nutjob, because the police did not take him seriously as a suspect. He came back to Villisca 2 weeks after the murders, he convinced a minister to show him round the house, the house where they were murdered, and there were a group of investigators there, and he blagged it and said that he was an investigator as well. So he had a good old nosy round the house. And what do they say about killers, especially serial killers? They will integrate themselves into the crime. Oh, I feel like, yes. I mean, to me, it sounds very much like Reverend is the one. Because of the time, they found it incredibly difficult to believe that a man of God, a travelling reverend, would be able to commit such a crime. In the autumn of 1912, it was because these letters continued so much, they decided to quietly investigate the reverend. He then left and they couldn't find him again until 1914. He was arrested in 1914, but not for what you think. It wasn't for this case. He was arrested for sending obscene mail. He had reached out or put something out, like an advertisement for a secretary, and then someone had replied to him, and he had then replied saying that if she was to work for him, he would require her to work with no clothes on. Dirty devil. And then you think, they are like, oh no, a man of God could not have committed this crime. What about that letter? Would you think a man of God would say that? Do we now? Like, come on. He was charged, he was placed in a mental institute, not a prison, and then he had lots of therapy before he was released. Oh God, I can't imagine what that therapy was like. Therapy. In 1912? Wow, 1914. It came to light that he was, I think a lot of his behaviour was ignored because he was a reverend. He was known to be a peeping Tom. So he used to peep in windows at women getting changed and things like that. And then he's written this obscene letter. Yeah, very strange character with lots of issues. He would also talk about being terrified of being accused of the murders. So do you remember Frank, businessman Frank? So the guy that everyone thought he would have hired, there was an alibi. So that was like, no. But then it was rumoured that Frank was the forcing hand at Reverend Kelly being arrested. So he used his persuasion to get him arrested for the murders, Reverend. And that made everybody very, very dubious because it felt like he was trying to get the heat off of him, probably was. They've already looked at William, his man that they thought might have committed the murder for him, and that was all done and dusted. But he probably still felt like people were pointing the finger at him, and they probably were, because he was the only person that really hated Joe. Anyway, it came into play because he forced the Reverend to be arrested, basically. He was arrested on May the 14th, Reverend, 1917. And there was strong evidence against him. There really was. The conversation on the train that he'd had before the bodies were discovered. That to me at first, I was like, well, he did it then, didn't he? Right? But when you then find out that he's a peeping Tom, he could have very well seen the murder because of his nature of peeping on people, or perhaps not witnessed the murder, but peeked in, and I think all the curtains were shut though. All the curtains were shut, so unless and nobody else could see the bodies, so I'm talking rubbish. I was thinking perhaps he'd seen the bodies early in the morning and then scooted off on a train, but nobody else that was looking around the house at 7:38 in the morning, nobody else saw in to see what had happened. So that can't be right. The only way that he would have known was if he committed the murders, or he witnessed it because he was up late at night peeping through windows, and perhaps the murderer didn't close the curtains until after the murders, but that's a bit silly. Also, there was his mental state. It seems like there was a lot going on with him mentally. He also sent a bloodied shirt to be laundered 2 weeks after the murder, like a bloodied shirt. That doesn't look good now. Not to mention his utter obsession with the case. bonkers obsession, and writing all of these letters to the police and to the family. So a lot of evidence, really. Also, in my own opinion, the murder scene and the covering of the bodies and the covering of the glass, the leaving of lamps at the ends of the beds, that to me is somebody not in their right mind, like the Reverend. And all, but I mean, he's been sent to a mental institute, and also that the kind of sort of remorse, religioususness of those things, and also the bacon is just mental. They interrogated him a lot, so I do take his confession with a pinch of salt. But he did confess. He confessed to the murders. He later retracted this. So there were 2 trials. In the first trial, he was found not guilty. And in the second, it was, what's that? When it's not agreed upon. But so he went free. But in the first trial, I don't know how much went into play. People could not get over. It's almost like it's the opposite to what it is nowadays. Like nowadays, we understand that people that have bad mental health can do things, awful things, because they're not right in the mind, schizophrenic and things like that. And it's due to mental illness, and it's terribly sad. It really is. Like, people have psychotic breaks and all sorts of things. But it almost was, the thinking process was like the opposite. It was like, how can this delicate, mentally disturbed man murder 8 people? How could he do that? He's not right. And they saw it as that was an excuse for him not to have been the killer. Whereas now it's like, yeah, bacon. I know I keep calling back to it, but getting bacon out of the fridge and putting it there, like, come on. In his confession, he said that God made him do it. Now, the only thing that I struggle with here is the cigarettes in the loft. Was he a smoker? I can't find that information anywhere. He said that because of the peeping nature of his character, he said that he was walking home and he saw the Stillinger girls in the guest bedroom downstairs getting ready for bed. And God told him to do it. He said, God said to him, suffer the children to come unto me. He said himself, he found the axe outside, which does fit because it was kept outside. He then let himself in through the kitchen. He said he killed the entire family and the Stillinger girls and then left at first light, and that would make sense with the time that he got on the train. By the time his trial came around in September, most people in the town believed that he was being framed. They believed that he was being framed by Frank, the senator, and that he was, oh, poor Reverend, look at him. He's not right in the head. He's being framed. I mean, I don't know that he's guilty, but there's a lot of evidence to say that he is. And he recounted his confession in his second trial, but wouldn't any lawyer tell you to do that? I reckon so. I have to mention Henry Moore. He's not a relation to Josiah Moore, but he was convicted of murdering his mother and grandmother. This was with an axe, and it was months after the murder of the Moore family. And a detective thought that Moore was not only responsible for the murder of his grandmother and his mother with an axe, but also the Moore family and the Stillinger girls and all of those other murders in the Midwest. He really thought that he was the culprit for all of it. And again, that does kind of sit, doesn't it? I don't know about Moore because I'm not sure whether he covered his grandma and his mum and did the same rituals and things like that. But, it is a serial killer that is not Reverend Kelly. That's also possible. Reverend Kelly really could just be somebody suffering, somebody that other man, Andy Sawyer, he was all involved in the case and obsessed with it and talking about it all of the time. And then Moore was sent to prison for a long time, Henry Moore, for the murder of his grandmother and his mother. So that just sort of like dropped. They were like, well, he's in prison for a long old time now, so if he was the culprit, he's serving time. And that was the end of that. The biggest thing that I think with the Reverend is that he was on the train, but again, this was a long time ago. Witnesses, did they remember exactly when he started talking about the case? How long was he on the train? Was he on the train for 7 hours, a whole day? Could they have... No, he must have... If he was on the train at 5... Oh my God. I've just realised there's no mobile phones or anything. I was like, oh, maybe he was on the train at 5 and then he got a text at 8:30 and realised about the murders and heard about it and then talked about it. Oh my God, Sophie, there were no phones. He got on the train. He couldn't have possibly known about the murders unless he'd really committed the murders or witnessed the murders. And if he witnessed the murders, why didn't he say who it was? Okay. That piece of evidence makes me think he's my main guy, in my opinion. Just started drilling outside. Okay. In 2017, there was a book brought out called The Man on the Train. Bill James and his daughter, Rachel McCarthy James, they investigated this and they believed that this was the work of a serial killer called Paul Miller. He was an immigrant that might have been from Germany. And they believed that there was a string of murders. They looked at loads of newspaper stuff and investigated it, and they believed that he was the murderer because there was a string. And again, like the whole theory with a serial killer, whoever it may be, they found strings of murders around the US and that all had lots of things in common. I don't know why. There must have been reason. I mean, I haven't read the book. Let me know if you have read the book. If it's like, oh yeah, I think it was that guy, because then I might have to read the book. I might have to go down that rabbit hole. But from what I have researched, the Reverend Kelly, he is in my brain. If there's a reason that you are like, no, I don't think it was, let me know. I like cases like this where it's like, oh, what about this? What about that? I used to hate them because it used to fill my mind and I used to just be stuck thinking about it and like, oh, like I need to know the truth. I mean, let's be real. It was 1912 and there is no one knows. So that's almost like, okay, no one knows. But I like the theory of it. It's a real whodunit. That sort of thing. The house is still there now to this day, and it had loads of owners. They all moved in, found it weird, moved on, and then it was restored in 1994 because it was nearly going to be torn down. It became quite dilapidated, and then it was restored, and now you can stay in it overnight. What? I'd be too terrified. And people say it's haunted. It's a hub for like paranormal ghost hunter type people. They like to go there. I mean, you know, I'd go and do something like that in the day, just to have a look and see if I felt anything. I think that could be quite interesting, but not at night. Whoop. And there have been stories. One man stayed there, and I believe he stayed on his own. And then he was found the next morning by the caretaker. And when he'd arrived, he had a hunting knife on his belt. And when the caretaker came in the morning, he found him. So he'd paid to stay there. He found him and he was stabbed. That was scary. Big gust of wind. And that's freaky, isn't it? So, yeah. And there were other things. People have said that they've seen this and they've seen that and they've heard noises and voices, like voices without bodies. Just terrifying. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1998, and the current owners, they don't live in it. Good move. And they just sell tours during the day and they like rent it out at night. I bet they make a packet actually. Sadly, it is still morbid, isn't it? It's still morbid curiosity. Let me know if you'd stay there, or if you have. Oh, I know quite a lot of you are in the US of A. Let me know if you've stayed there. I think that is all I have for you on today's case. I'm going to have to wrap it up because there's going to just be so much noise. But I wanted to tell you about my tooth. I will. Maybe I'll tell you on Friday, because if this carries on too much, I might have heart failure. But yeah, I'm glad I've got through with the hole in my face. It's much better today. I am 5 days after, and it wasn't just a simple tooth coming out. It had a root canal, so the tooth was broken, and then when he pulled the tooth out, it shattered into 100 pieces. It was all in my mouth, and the dental nurse was like crazy with that Hoover thing. And I was like, oh, there's bits all here. I'll get closer so you can hear me. And then the root, once the tooth had broken, like it wasn't all going to come out all in one go, and the roots are just cement, like dental cement, and there's 3. I didn't realise how big a root of a tooth is. So you've got 3 and they're massive. Huge buggers. And the first one, So I wasn't sedated, I just had the numbing stuff. He injected me a lot, and I could feel it all, going numb, but he did one inside. He said, this is going to sting. When someone, like a professional, nurse, dentist, says, this is going to sting, wow, watch out. I was like, off the bed. Anyway, then you've got these 3 routes. Just so you know, this is just from my learning of this experience. If I can share this wisdom with you so you don't have this ever in your life, if you are going to have a root canal tooth removed, be sedated. Have the happy gas. Just don't bother with it. Oh my gosh, it was so brutal. I had blood coming down my throat. I was like, she's suctioning away all this blood because I was freaking out. And it was a nightmare. It was a living nightmare. And the first route came out okay. The second route took ages. He was taking my roots and pulling my roots for 30 minutes, non-stop. Like, literally. It was just horrific. I swallowed parts of my own teeth. And then at the end, he said, do you want to, I cried. Not sobbing, but just the whole, like, after a while, I couldn't stop it. And I thought, I'm never ever doing this again. There will always be sedation in my future for dental work. And then at the end, I had to gather myself. He's a lovely dentist, lovely man. I'm very lucky. And you're all right, and the nurse rubbing my shoulder. And then he said, do you want to have a look at what came out? And before I could answer, under my nose were my 3 massive roots. 3 huge roots. One of them had infection, like, wrapped around the end of it, and he thought it was fascinating. I was like, look, this is why you became a dentist. And I did not. Ugh. Like, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see what came out of my socket. Oh, and it's just been an experience. Anyway, I'm going to love you and leave you. I will continue, if I have anything more to say, on Friday, because this situation just causes me stress and aggro, and I'm not down for it. I'm going to go in and have a cup of lukewarm tea. Okay. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Sin and Tonic. I hope you can join me next week for another true crime story and a glass or a vase or a pint of gin. See you on Friday. Bye.